The courtroom was cold, like the air on the morning he was arrested. The clock read 9:12 when the doors opened, and a handcuffed man entered with short, almost shuffling steps. The jacket he wore was so old it looked like it had been found on an abandoned battlefield. Dirty, threadbare, with a hole in the shoulder and old stains of mud and grease, it bore the marks of decades of neglect. Not of seasons, but of neglect. On his feet, the shoes had almost no soles. One of them, in fact, no longer covered the floor. The leather had torn, and the sole was falling apart, leaving the heel in direct contact with the icy floor. The man's eyes were empty, not with malice, but with absence, of someone who had seen too much, suffered too much, lost too much. He looked like any other man, or worse, he looked like no one. He sat down in the dock without resistance. His name, announced by an officer, echoed through the room without causing any commotion. Antonio Carlos Ribeiro, 73 years old, no fixed address, accused of trespassing. It all seemed like just another ordinary day for that court. Another case of a homeless man trying to find shelter from the cold. Another social nuisance to be removed from the urban landscape. The accusation was simple. He had slept behind a bakery in the early hours of the morning when the temperature dropped to 4°C. He slept among empty flour sacks, huddled under cardboard and a newspaper blanket. He said nothing. He didn't even look at the judge. He was present but absent. He existed, but he didn't take up space. On the other side, the prosecutor was leafing through the case files in a hurry, almost bored. The public defender's office hadn't even sent a representative. For everyone there, it was just another routine, unimportant case. But for Judge Larissa Montenegro, it wasn't. She read the file with a neutral expression, trained by years of routine, until her eyes stopped on a detail, a name, a surname, a shock. She held her breath. The hand holding the pen trembled. On the sheet of paper in front of her was written, Defendant, Antonio Carlos Ribeiro. For a second, Larissa stopped being a judge. She became a sister again. Sister of Henrique Montenegro, who died in combat almost 20 years ago. And in the memories she kept of him, one figure always appeared, a man he mentioned in all his letters, a soldier, a sergeant, an anonymous hero named Antonio Ribeiro. Larissa sat up slightly in her chair. The man in front of her was different, aged, haggard, unrecognizable, but his eyes, even tired, betrayed who he was. The judge swallowed hard. The name was there, printed in simple letters, but loaded with memories that cut deeper than any sentence. Antonio Carlos Ribeiro. Judge Larissa leafed through the pages of the case again, this time with different eyes. Each line seemed to echo the voice of her brother, who had died almost 2 decades ago, but was still present in the letters, lovingly kept by her mother. Henrique, his brother, had been a captain, a respected, brave, and sensitive soldier. He was the one who wrote letters by hand, always scented with desert sand and stained with sweat. And in almost all of them, one phrase was repeated: "If it weren't for him, I wouldn't have come back." It was about Antonio. In the last letter, before Henry returned from the mission in which he would be mortally wounded, he said, "This man, Larissa, this man needs to be remembered. One day, you need to meet him." But fate never allowed it. Henry died shortly after his return, and that man, the hero who saved his brother, had disappeared. Until today, now he stood before her, not as an honoree, not as a hero, but as a defendant, handcuffed, torn, cold. The prosecutor began his speech as if reading a bulletin. Antonio Ribeiro was arrested for trespassing. He was found sleeping behind the Santa Cecilia bakery in the Centro Sul neighborhood at 3:17 in the morning. Repeat offender. He represents a risk to public order. The judge was no longer listening. The words came distantly, muffled. What mattered now was not in the records. It was in the memory. It was in the eyes of that man who, even sunk in shame and oblivion, still held something, a hidden dignity. Larissa couldn't act impulsively, not here. But she couldn't ignore what she felt either. Discreetly, she took a piece of paper and wrote something. She folded it. He called an officer and whispered, "Deliver this personally to lawyer Eduardo Ferraz." The officer nodded and quickly left. A few minutes later, Antonio looked up. For a brief moment, their eyes met. She wanted to speak. She wanted to say, "I know who you are." But it was not time yet. The trial continued, but everything had already changed. Time seemed to stand still in that room, as if everyone was oblivious to what was about to happen. The prosecutor continued with his automatic speech, citing articles from the penal code and predictable arguments. Antonio remained motionless. He didn't even blink often. It was as if he was on the sidelines of his own life. But then the courtroom door opened again. A tall man walked in, wearing a dark suit with a serious expression and a leather briefcase in his hands. His presence instantly caught everyone's attention. He was well known. Eduardo Ferraz, a renowned lawyer, often seen in high-profile trials. His name was respected and feared by prosecutors and colleagues alike. But what no one understood was what he was doing there, in such a small case. "Your Excellency," he said in a firm voice, "Eduardo Ferraz. From this moment on, I assume the defense of the defendant, Antonio Carlos Ribeiro." The prosecutor's eyes widened, almost offended. Voluntary representation at the last minute? Unacceptable. Larissa did not hesitate. "It is accepted. Continue, Dr. Ferraz." The mood in the room changed. What had been a routine trial had now become something more intense. Ferraz himself seemed to have entered that courtroom not just to fulfill a legal duty, but to uncover a story. And what he didn't know yet was how much that story would affect him. While everyone was tidying up their papers, Larissa watched him in silence. She knew he would understand the message, and he did. When he received the note that had been delivered minutes earlier, Eduardo had read only one sentence: "This man saved my brother." And that was enough. Ferraz quickly leafed through the case file. His initial questions were simple but accurate. He asked for time. He requested a review of the complaint. He contested the accusation with solid arguments. There was no invasion. There was desperation. There was no threat. There was a man trying to survive a night of extreme cold. And where there is no intent to possess, there is no crime. There is institutional abandonment. There is historical neglect. The prosecutor tried to counter with references to recidivism and disturbance of order. But Ferraz responded coldly. "What is repeated here is not the crime, but the failure of the system. The error is not his, it is ours." Silence fell over the court. In the defendant's chair, Antonio remained silent, as if none of this had anything to do with him. But Ferraz could already tell. Something about that man was different. Even though he was fragile, there was still a firmness in his gaze. Even though he was bent over, there was still dignity in his chest. He was like a soldier in ruins, but a soldier. After the hearing, in the hallway, Ferraz approached the judge and said, "Now tell me, who is he really?" Larissa hesitated. She took a deep breath, and with teary eyes she replied, "He's the man who saved my brother's life." And then he disappeared. Eduardo stared into space for a moment, and then he said, as if he were taking on a war, "Then it won't be just another case. We'll go all the way." In the days that followed, Eduardo Ferraz dedicated himself in a way he rarely did. To most people, Antonio Ribeiro was just another homeless elderly man, surviving on the fringes of the system. But Eduardo felt it. There was something hidden there, something that no one saw, something that had perhaps been erased. His first stop was home base, the public archives. He searched through military records, enlistment histories, lists of decorations. But the more he looked, the stranger it seemed. The documents existed, but they were incomplete. Where mission reports should have been, there were only summaries. Where he expected combat medical certificates, there were gaps. Antonio's name appeared, but always in half, fragmented, as if someone, at some point, had begun to erase his history. Edward wasn't the type to give up. And he wasn't the type to rely solely on digital files, either. He started reaching out to his old contacts. Insiders, gym buddies, former clients, retired military men. He called a retired colonel who fell silent when he heard his name. Antonio Ribeiro? That's the name of a military establishment. That man was a legend among the non-commissioned officers. But he disappeared after his discharge. No one ever heard from him again. The answer came with astonishment, almost incredulity. Apparently that man, forgotten in the dock, was once a symbol of honor, a frontline soldier. But after he left the army, it was as if he had evaporated. Eduardo began visiting Antonio at the custody center, where he was now temporarily housed. He brought blankets, hot coffee, and tried to talk. The answers were few, almost none. Antonio seemed to live in another time, another world. He would spend hours staring at the ground. He would mumble incoherent things. Every now and then he would say something about the jungle, about gunshots, about missions. And one afternoon he said a name that Eduardo recognized immediately. Enrique. The boy was stubborn. His shoulder was blown out and he still wanted to go back into the crossfire. Eduardo froze. Henry Montenegro. There was the bridge, the connection, the confirmation. It was that day that he brought a photo, a faded image of soldiers in a clearing, taken by a war photographer. One of them, wounded, was smiling sideways. It was Henrique. "This is Enrique Montenegro, isn't he?" Antonio looked. Time stopped. His eyes, previously dull, came to life for an instant. He touched the image with trembling hands, and in a low voice, as if confessing to a ghost, he murmured, "I pulled him by his vest. He was down with shrapnel in his leg. He said he was going to come back, that he wanted to introduce his sister." He paused for a long time. His breathing became heavy. "He called me a stubborn old man." At that moment, Eduardo understood. That man was not just a veteran. He was not just a name lost in old records. He was living proof of a history that the country tried to forget. That same evening, Edward returned to his office. He was tired, but he couldn't stop. He spread out all his notes, incomplete reports, copies of emails, old newspaper clippings on his desk. Then in a forgotten folder, he found what appeared to be just a footnote, a discreet reference to a military declassification program that had recently released old files. He accessed the portal, filled out forms, made authentications, requested documents, and waited. 2 days later, the answer arrived, a packet of PDFs marked confidential and now declassified. Eduardo read through them calmly. At first, it seemed like more of the same, bureaucracy, technical language, cold reports. But then came the mission, the ambush, the shootout, and his name, Antonio Carlos Ribeiro. There it was, accounts of soldiers saved, descriptions of heroic conduct under heavy fire, records of him dragging 4 wounded soldiers out of a combat zone, that he refused to be evacuated, even while bleeding, in order to continue helping, that he held his ground alone, allowing the troops to reorganize and avoiding a massacre. The last page of the dossier contained something even more shocking, a formal recommendation for a decoration, National Order of Courage. But the case was shelved, never finalized. Eduardo put down the papers for a moment. He took a deep breath. He looked at the table, now covered in evidence. This wasn't just a defense. It was a reparation. He immediately called Larissa. "Judge, trying." He didn't just save his brother. He saved an entire team, and then he was left behind. On the other end of the line, Larissa took a while to respond. When she spoke, her voice was firm but choked. "Bring it all. Let's show him who he is. And more than that, let's remind the country of what he did." 2 weeks later, the court would meet again, but this time not to judge an invader, but to hear what history had hidden. The courtroom looked different that day. What had once seemed like a bureaucratic scene had now become a stage for historical redress. There was an air of hushed anticipation. Many in the audience did not even know exactly what was going to happen, only that it would be something unusual. Antonio entered as before. Short steps, shoulders slumped, but at his side now was Eduardo Ferraz, and in front of them on the defense table a pile of meticulously organized documents. Eduardo began his presentation without rushing, but with the firmness of someone carrying a mission. Your Honor, gentlemen present, what is about to be revealed is not just the defense of a defendant, it is the reconstruction of a history that was erased. And it is also, with all due respect, a mirror that shows where we have failed as a society. He picked up the first report. He showed the cover letterhead of the National Army. He read dates, names of officers, transcribed excerpts from field reports. Each document was a piece that assembled a puzzle of ignored dignity. Mr. Antonio Ribeiro served on a foreign mission under direct fire. He saved 4 soldiers. He refused to be evacuated, even though he was seriously injured. He remained in the field to ensure the survival of his team. His conduct was considered exemplary, and he was recommended for one of the country's highest military honors. But his case was shelved, forgotten. The prosecutor, who had been confident until then, was now rearranging papers without knowing what to do. His face, which had previously been proud, was now one of doubt. Judge Larissa remained silent, but her eyes no longer hid her emotion. She knew. That was true. That was what her brother had told her, in letters that now seemed to shout from the walls of the courtroom. Eduardo then asked, "I request, Your Excellency, that 3 military witnesses who acted in the same mission be heard." It was authorized. A tall man with grey hair and an impeccable dress uniform entered first. He marched to the center and introduced himself. General Augusto Marins, retired. I was a lieutenant on the mission in question. I was shot in open field, and it was this man, pointing at Antonio, who dragged me for almost 100 meters under gunfire. If I'm alive, it's because of him. I've never forgotten, but the system, it seems to have forgotten. The second and third witnesses followed. 2 former soldiers, both now civilians, told in broken voices how they were pulled out of the line of fire by the man who could now barely hold his own spine upright. Antonio listened to everything in silence. His gaze was still vacant. He seemed unable to believe that they were talking about him. For so long, no one had said a single word to him. Now he was being called a hero. Eduardo then made the final request. I asked permission to read an excerpt from the declassified report. Lieutenant Ribeiro demonstrated high personal risk behavior by voluntarily remaining in a cover position after ensuring the evacuation of 3 wounded soldiers. His decision allowed the platoon to be reorganized and prevented further casualties. The room was completely silent. Not even the sound of pages turning could be heard. It was as if everyone was holding their breath. Larissa then stood up. With a firm voice, but with tears in her eyes, she declared, "What we have here is not just a lawsuit. It is a snapshot of an institutional failure. A man who served with honor, who was ignored by administrative errors, who should be being decorated and not judged." She then gestured to the door. 2 soldiers entered. One of them carried a small blue box. Inside lay a golden brooch, the Order of National Courage. Antonio looked at it without understanding. It took him seconds to process what he saw. When he finally understood, his first reaction was to refuse. "No," he whispered. I couldn't save Henrique. He died because of me." Larissa approached, ignoring formalities. She was no longer the judge. She was her sister. "He lived because of you. He came home. He wrote me letters. He spoke of you as the bravest man he had ever met, and he asked me to find you." Antonio did not respond, just cried, and then everyone stood up. The prosecutor, the military, the employees, the curious, in silence. At that moment, no one needed to say anything. The judge sighed deeply. "The charges have been dropped, and the state will urgently begin regularizing all rights and benefits provided for by law." Eduardo nodded. Antonio lowered his head, but this time it wasn't out of shame. It was for relief. The following week, The courtroom reopened, but the atmosphere was different now. There was no longer a noisy audience, no more journalists with cameras. It was a simple ceremony, intimate, reserved only for those who really mattered. Antonio was there again, but for the first time without handcuffs. He wore new clothes, simple but clean. A light grey suit, polished shoes, a clean-shaven face, still hunched over by time, but now with his chin held high. The man who had once seemed invisible now took up space. He had a presence. Beside her were Eduardo Ferraz and 2 officers of the National Army in impeccable ceremonial uniforms. Further back, discreetly, Larissa observed, not as a judge, but as a sister, as a witness. One of the officers stood up, holding a sheet of paper. He read aloud with a solemn intonation, "For proven bravery in combat, high personal risk conduct, and direct contribution to the survival of members of the armed forces, the National Army honorably awards the National Order of Courage to Sub-Lieutenant Antonio Carlos Ribeiro." The blue box was opened. The medal gleamed in the soft light of the room, but Antonio remained motionless. He looked at the decoration as if he were looking at a cracked mirror, something that reflects parts of him but not the whole. He took a deep breath. His voice was low, almost imperceptible. "I don't deserve this. He died." The silence was immediate. Eduardo approached. He placed a hand on Antonio's shoulder and said calmly, "But he lived long enough to come home, to write to his sister, to tell her who you were. You were the reason he still believed in people." Larissa stepped down from the platform and walked towards Antonio. Her eyes were watery, but her voice was firm. "Death does not erase what was saved, Second Lieutenant. You gave my brother time, and you gave us something that no medal can represent." Antonio squeezed his eyes shut. A sob escaped. Emotion was overflowing. He still held the guilt like someone holding an old rifle, like a soldier who had outlived everyone, except himself. "I just did what anyone would do," he muttered. The officer handed him the medal. Antonio held it in both hands. For a moment, he didn't know whether he should wear it or just look at it. Finally, he closed his eyes and rested his forehead against it. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling, "for not forgetting me." The next gesture did not come from Larissa, nor from the officers. It came from the prosecutor. He stood up. He straightened his posture and, with a respectful gesture, saluted. The entire room followed, not out of protocol, but out of reverence. That afternoon, the government made the granting of a lifetime pension, assisted housing and full medical care to Sub-Lieutenant Antonio Carlos Ribeiro. The case was sent to the Ministry of Defense as an example of a serious failure and worthy reparation. The press tried to turn it into a headline. They wanted interviews, exclusives, documentaries. But Antonio refused everything. He didn't want fame, nor the spotlight. He just wanted silence, and a place where I could, finally, sleep in peace. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, 1 kitchen, 1 bathroom. The walls, painted white, still smelled of new paint. There was no expensive furniture or modern appliances, but there was something Antonio hadn't seen in decades: a home. After so many years sleeping on park benches, under awnings, on damp cardboard, that space felt like a castle. For the first time, he had a bed with clean sheets, a hot shower, and a kettle to make his breakfast at his leisure. And he did, every day. A silent but profound ritual. He watched the water boil, the steam rise, the aroma fill the room. He filled the cup slowly, as if that moment was sacred. It was there, in that small gesture, that he felt he was alive, and perhaps at peace. The television remained off. He preferred the sounds of the street, horns, footsteps, distant voices. It was proof that the world still turned, and that he was finally part of it again. He received visitors from time to time. Nurses, social workers, army officers checking papers, but the smile only appeared when Eduardo knocked on the door. The lawyer came without warning. He brought fresh bread, fruit, and news from the city. They sat at the kitchen table and talked for hours. And during these meetings, Antonio relaxed. For the first time in many years, He allowed himself to laugh. For the first time, he didn't feel like he had to defend himself against anything. "Is everything okay now, Mr. Antonio?" Eduardo asked at the end of each visit. "I'm trying to learn to be at peace," he replied with a slight smile. "But it wasn't always easy. Sometimes I woke up sweating. I still heard gunshots that weren't there. Sometimes he cried in the dark, hugging a blanket, but there was a difference now. He knew he could go back to sleep." One Friday afternoon, the intercom rang. It was Larissa. Antonio hesitated. He thought about not opening it. He felt ashamed. But something inside him told him he should. She came in with a simple folder in her hands. They sat at the kitchen table, in front of freshly brewed coffee. For a few seconds, neither of them said anything. The sound of the fire under the kettle was all that could be heard. Larissa placed the folder on the table and pushed it towards him. "These are letters from my brother. You've already seen some of them. I've never shown others to anyone." Antonio touched the envelopes as if he were touching something sacred. He opened them slowly. He recognized the handwriting. He read it. "Sergeant Ribeiro saved me. Not only my body, but my mind. He taught me to stay calm, to not give in to fear. He taught me what courage is. If I ever come back, I want you to meet this man. He doesn't say much, but he says everything in what he does." He read another one, then another. Some were about war, others were about fear. But they all ended with gratitude. "For so long, I thought no one remembered," Antonio murmured, his eyes fixed on the paper. Larissa held back her tears, but couldn't help it. "The world may forget, but those who were saved never forget." That night, Antonio slept soundly, without nightmares. For the first time in years, the silence in the room didn't hurt. It was welcoming. It was deserved. In the following days, life continued simply. Breakfast, sweeping the floor, arranging the pictures. Small habits, small victories, and then one random afternoon the doorbell rang. It was Larissa again. She was carrying a brown envelope. "That's for when you're ready." "Ready for what?" She just smiled. "To forgive yourself." He didn't open it. He placed the envelope on the table. He sat down by the window, from where he could see the square next door. Children were running. A dog was barking. The sun was shining through the leaves. A boy in a military school uniform ran past, stopped and looked up. He saw the old man in the window and, not knowing who he was, waved. Antonio returned the gesture with his hand. He smiled, small, discreet, but genuine. For so long, he thought no one remembered. But now, he remembered himself. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone who was forgotten, or inspired you to look with more humanity at those whom society abandons, then leave your like in this video. Write just one word here in the comments, "I remember," because sometimes that alone is enough to honor those who deserve it. Subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who needs to hear this message, because here we count stories that touch the heart, and you are part of it.